So welcome to the video on rounding numbers, which is part of Learning Objective 1 for Unit 661. The way I see it is when we round a number, imagine that you're going somewhere with the kids in the car and one of the kids tells you that they've forgotten something. How far would you go without turning back home? You know, how long would you travel before you decided that you're going to keep going rather than come home and get the stuff for the kids? So we have choices. We can either do the lower end, as in go back home, or we can continue to the destination. So the main tips for rounding, when they ask you to round to a certain number, as in round to the nearest 10, round to the nearest 100 or thousands, you always look at the number to the right of that column. So if you're rounding to the nearest 100, you look at the tens column because that's on the right. And then you compare to the halfway number, as in you compare with 5. If the number in the tens column, if we're rounding to hundreds, if the number in the tens column on the right is 4, 3, 2 or 1, we'd round down. And if it's 5 or more, we round up. And we always have choices. If we're rounding to the nearest 100, it's either the lower 100 below the number or the next 100 above the number. So if the number that we're comparing is 4 or less, we round down. If it's 5 or more, we round up. So some examples. Rounding to the nearest 10, you may get asked these questions. 34 to the nearest 10. Well, like we said earlier, if we're rounding to the nearest 10, we need to look at the number to the right, which is the units column. And then we compare it with 5. So we're rounding to the nearest 10, look at the units, and the units column has a 4 in it, and 4 is less than 5. So the number rounds down to the lower multiple of 10, which is 30. So 4 is less than 5, so the number rounds down. If we were to round 995 to the nearest 10, well, this is the tens column, so we always look at the number to the right. So we're comparing 5 with 5, and obviously 5 is included in the 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9 numbers, which would round up. So because this 5 in the units column rounds up, the number will become 1000 to the nearest 10. We'll do some more examples, and it's easier to do examples than to explain it sometimes. We'll round these numbers to the nearest 100, so it's always worth writing what the columns are. So we've got the hundreds, tens and units. So if we're rounding to the nearest 100, which is this column, we look at the column to the right. So the number that we're comparing is 4. And because 4 is less than 5, the number rounds down to the lower amount of hundreds. So this will become 300. So 349 is less than halfway, basically, between home and our destination, where the home number would be 300 and the destination, I said in the example at the start, would be 400. So 349 rounded to the nearest 100 is 300. And similarly with 350, it's always worth writing the place value columns above. If we're rounding this to the nearest 100, we need to look at the column to the right of the hundreds, which is the tens column. So we're looking at this 5, and because it's 5 or more, the number is going to round up to the next 100, which is 400. So that's the answer there. Sometimes we round down to 0. You're allowed to round to 0 if that's what the answer is. So in this next example, even though there's no hundreds in this number, it's just 49, I could write the column header there anyway. So because I'm rounding to the nearest 100, as it says here, then we always look at the number to the right of that, which is the 4 in the tens column. And 4 is less than 5, so it rounds down. So the actual answer, 49 to the nearest 100, is actually 0 lots of 100, which is 0. So 49 to the nearest 100 is actually 0, and we're allowed to do that. If it was 50, then it would round up to 100. So some more examples. We've got 9,999, and we're going to round to the nearest 10 and the nearest 1,000 and the nearest 10,000. We're going to do different roundings for different parts of this question. It's like 3 questions in one, if you like. So it's always worth putting the units, tens, hundreds and thousands above. So we're rounding to the nearest 10 here. So because we're rounding to the nearest 10, we look at the number to the right of that, which is the units. And 9 is included in the 5 or more region, so this number will round up. And when this 9 rounds up, it makes the next 9 round up, and so on. So the actual answer to part A, if we wanted to call it part A, is 10,000. The next part we could call part B, rounding to the nearest 1,000. Well, if we're rounding to the nearest 1,000, we look at the number in the hundreds column to the right. And that's also 9, which is 5 or more, so it rounds up again to 10,000. And then you may have already guessed what happens next. For part C, if we're rounding 9,999 to the nearest 10,000, well, this would be the 10,000s column. Of course, there's a 0 in there at the moment because there's nothing shown in front of the thousands. So we look at the column to the right of the amount that we're rounding to. So if we're rounding to 10,000, we look at the thousands column, and that is more than 5. So even with this different number that we're rounding to, the answer is the same, and you'll often find that that's the case. If you sometimes round a number to the nearest 10, it also makes the number to the nearest 100 or the nearest 1,000, etc. Not always, but sometimes. So we've got 5,501 to the nearest 1,000. Well, this is the thousands column, so we'll look at the number to the right of that. Doesn't matter what column it's in, really, as long as it's the one to the right, we know which way to round. And this number is 5 or more, so this 5 will round up, and 5,501 to the nearest 1,000 will become 6,000. Then if we're rounding to the nearest 100,000, well, we need to add some columns here because we've only got a thousands number, so the tens of thousands would go there and the hundreds of thousands would go in the next column. We can fill in the zeros. You wouldn't often get asked this sort of question, but it's worth knowing what to do. So if we're rounding to the nearest 100,000, we look at the number in the tens of thousands to the right, even though it's 0. And because it's less than 5, the number rounds down. So that rounds everything else down to the right as well. So 5,501 to the nearest 100,000 is 0 lots of 100,000. The only other option we could have had is 1 lot of 100,000. But we've proved that that's not true. So 5,501 to the nearest 100,000 is equal to 0. We can also use decimal fractional parts. So hundreds, tens, units, decimal place. Then we've got the tenths. Then we've got the 100ths, because every time you move to the left with place value, you multiply by 10, and every time you move to the right, it's like dividing by 10. So 565.44 to the nearest tenth. Well, because it's asking us to round to the nearest tenth, which is this column, we look at the column to the right. So this is the number that we're comparing with 5. And this is only 4, so it rounds down. So to the nearest tenth, this answer will be 565.4. To the nearest 10,000, well, it's only a hundreds number, so we need to put the place value columns in. So after the hundreds, we have the thousands, and then we have the tens of thousands to the left. Only because it's asking us to round to the nearest 10,000. So because it is, we look at the number to the right of the tens of thousands column. And of course, that's actually a 0 because there's nothing in there. It's only 565-ish, so there's no thousands there. So because this is less than 5, the whole number rounds down. So the answer to this part is 0. And I've got another example. You may not know what the number is when you first look at it, so if ever you're unsure what a number is, just put the units, tens, hundreds, thousands. I haven't got enough space really, but then we've got the tens of thousands, and finally the hundreds of thousands, which is this column where the 4 is. Could have set it out a little bit better maybe, but anyway, it's asking us to round it to the nearest unit. And because it's asking for the nearest unit, we look at the number to the right of the units and compare it with 5. A unit, of course, when it asks you to do it to the nearest unit, that means the nearest whole number, or the nearest integer, which is a whole number. So basically we're rounding it so that it won't have any decimal fraction part. And because this is a 4, the answer is going to be 454,454, because this 4 rounds all of that down to 0. So there's no fractional part, and this, of course, here is a whole number. So we've done it correctly. Next, we're going to do it to the nearest 100th. Well, we know that after the decimal point, we have the tenths, then we have the 100ths, and then we have the thousandths. So because it's asking us to round to the nearest 100th, which is the 5, it's the 4 column, the thousandths column, that we're going to compare. And because this is a 4, it rounds down, so the answer will be 454,454.45. To the nearest 1,000, well, because it's asking us to round to the nearest 1,000, we look at the column to the right of that, which is the hundreds, and this number is less than 5, so it rounds down, to the lower 1,000 rather than the next 1,000 up, which would have ended in 5,000. So to the nearest 1,000, it's going to be 454,000 with nothing else, because this 4 basically got rid of everything else and turned it to zeros. And part D is asking us to round the same number to the nearest 10,000. So because it's asking us to do that, we look at the column to the right, which is the thousands column, and that is 4. So the answer is going to be 450,000 to the nearest 10,000 number. Because what we're asking ourselves really when it's asking to the nearest 10,000, is this going to end up as a 5 or a 6? Because it's already 5, but is it going to be 5 with a load of zeros after, or a 6 with a load of zeros after? And finally, the millions. Well, the millions column comes after the hundreds of thousands, and of course there's a 0 there because it's not even 500,000, this number, so it's less than 1 million. So rounding to the nearest million, we look at the number to the right of that, which is the hundreds of thousands, and this is a 4, so it rounds down. So this number, 454,454.454, so the nearest million is 0. So I hope this has helped a little bit. The main points that we need to remember are: always look at the number to the right of the column that it's asking you to round to, and then compare the number in that column on the right with 5. So if it's 1, 2, 3 or 4, you round down, and if it's 5 or more, you round up. So hopefully that was helpful, and good luck.